Hello and welcome back to Radio Caroline, whether you're tuned in on air or via the YouTube channel as well. Thank you very much for being with us today. And our special guest defines the word legend, really, from Visage to Ultravox and Band-Aid and Live Aid, all the way through to his upcoming 26-date tour, Catalogue the Hits. A 26-date tour, you don't hear about that much these days. It's my great pleasure to welcome Midge Ure. How are you doing, Midge?
I'm doing incredibly well, thank you, Joe.
Good, good. Thank you for being here. It's a real pleasure to have you on Radio Caroline. I don't know if it's a bit bold to assume, but the timeline seems to add up that maybe you kind of know of Radio Caroline. Maybe you grew up with it around.
That's a very nice way of saying, well, you're old, so you must remember when it started. Caroline's been around for a long, long time. It was one of the, I suppose, it was one of the music links that we had as as youths growing up. Back in the day. So, if you wanted to hear pop music on the radio, you had to find alternative stations, and Caroline was one of those. It started off, if I'm correct, it was a pirate radio station, wasn't it? It was on a
Absolutely.
ship bobbing about in the ocean somewhere, which must have been horrendous for those poor DJs doing that stuff. Try. That was before everything was digitized. So try playing a record on a moving ship. It can't be easy.
Absolutely, yeah. I can only imagine what that would have been like. I've got it easy today. And was there any kind of artists around that time that you heard, whether on one of the pirate stations or anyone at the time, that kind of early influences for you, if you like, anyone that inspired you to become a musician?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, the reason that anyone gets into whatever their chosen career is, their passionate career, is because you're influenced by someone else and what they're doing. Whether you're an architect or a writer or a musician or a footballer or whatever, you're always inspired by other people. And back then, I would have heard, without knowing it, I learned, what a well-crafted song was, without actually having to think about it or being taught about it, just by hearing bands like, the Small Faces or the Beatles or, Jerry and the Pacemakers, whoever it happened to be on the radio at the time, you were kind of like a sponge. And
Right.
those influences went in without even recognizing it. And there's a reason that a lot of artists in the 80s are still resonating today. What they wrote. There seemed to be a glut of really good writers in the 80s, irrespective of what genre of music you felt you belonged to. The songwriting was really good, and I put it down to the fact that we were the radio generation. We soaked up everything that came out of radios and learned how to construct an interesting piece of music. And in the 80s, it was our chance to write those things, and we just had this massive glut of great stuff. So yeah, thanks to stations like yours, like Caroline, that was responsible in a kind of roundabout way for a lot of the good stuff that came out in the 80s.
Wow, that's fantastic and absolutely right. I mean, some of the names you mentioned as well, the Beatles, the Small Faces, they're always going to come up with influences of people of a certain generation.
Absolutely.
But obviously, you started before the 80s. That's perhaps when you found huge success. But your career started kind of earlier on in the 70s. I've got a note here that it was Slick was the first kind of big success you had. Obviously, having a huge number one single as well early on in your musical career. That must have been good.
It was. It's a bit like the running before you can walk. You find yourself with a number one record, and you've got no idea how to construct a song because in those days you were a kind of puppet, a musical puppet. You were, the songs were written by other people, produced by other people. In fact, the big number one record that Slick had was actually played by other people. We weren't allowed to play on the record, and it was your
Wow.
job. Yeah, it was boy band stuff. It was your job just to go out there and sing the thing. Although we were, Slick were a band who'd been playing the Scottish circuit for quite a few years, and we were more than capable of doing it. You just weren't allowed. So it was a kind of odd start. You find yourself with a number one record and none of the attributes that would go along with that, the feeling of achievement. I didn't feel as though I'd achieved anything, but I didn't realize that that was the starting point for what was going to become quite a long career.
Of course, yeah, of course. And is it right you turned down singing in the Sex Pistols to kind of stick around with Slick? Is that right?
Well, I didn't know what I was going to be doing in the Sex Pistols, and I didn't know it was going to be the Sex Pistols.
Right.
When just prior to Slick putting out the first record, I was stopped in Glasgow, in the streets of Glasgow, by a couple of guys. One was Bernie Rhodes, who went on to manage the Clash, and the other one was Malcolm McLaren, who talked about Vivienne Westwood's clothes more than talking about music. And he said he was putting a band together. Uh, he didn't say it, but I think he implied it was in order to wear Vivienne Westwood's clothes. And would I join the band? But he hadn't asked if I was a musician, so I turned it down. I said, no, I've got a band and I'm perfectly happy doing what I'm doing here. Of course, that band was the Pistols. But he did
Right.
choose the right people. He found the right guys in the long run, but I wouldn't have been right for the Pistols at all. So what I was going to do within the Pistols, I've no idea, just like him. He had no idea what I was going to do.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Were you kind of into the punk movement at the time? Obviously you went on to do a lot of the synth stuff, but were you into punk and this revolution?
It hadn't arrived at this point. This was like 1975, so it was
Oh
just
wow.
prior to it all exploding. The punk thing. I suppose the Pistols and the Clash and the Damned would have been the first bands to kind of come along there, and that would have been late '76. So he was very in the forefront of what this movement was going to be. So by the dying embers of Slick, a year or so later, I was fortunate enough to, although I didn't join the Pistols, I was fortunate enough to be asked to come down to London from Glasgow by Glenn Matlock, the original bass player in the Sex Pistols. So in a
Right.
roundabout way, I ended up there just a little bit later than Malcolm McLaren had expected.
Right. Okay. Oh, 75. Yeah, that would have been just before punk. So wow,
Yeah,
very early on.
yeah. So it
And
hadn't happened yet.
that's incredible. Your connection with the Sex Pistols and Glenn Matlock, who you mentioned there, didn't just happen at that time because you and Glenn went on to be part of a band together as well. Is that right?
We did, yeah. Glenn had already put the nucleus of his band together once he left the Pistols. He had put the Rich Kids together, and he was looking for his elusive, fourth member, his singer, his front guy, and it was a music journalist who had seen Slick perform live in London, had said to Glenn, "He's the guy that you should contact." And Glenn just called me up out the blue. So it was like he threw me a lifeline, really. I didn't realize it at the time, but in hindsight, I could have ended up, doing what my dad did, driving a van around the streets of Glasgow, hadn't it been for Glenn having the wherewithal and I suppose the strength to choose someone who might make his band a little bit awkward to deal with. Bearing in mind the punk thing, I was incredibly uncool to join a new wave punk band. So it gave the Rich Kids a difficult path, but it was an amazing, as I say, lifeline for me.
Wow, excellent, excellent. And from Slick to Rich Kids and Rich Kids then to Visage as well, which again was a very different kind of musical style with that more synth sound, which again would have been quite fresh on the scene. What kind of made you jump again genres? Was it a bit difficult maybe switching between the musical styles?
No, well, it wasn't. I mean, it might look like jumping genres, but it wasn't. It was an evolution, I suppose. When I joined the Rich Kids in late '77, and 1978, I bought a synthesizer and brought it into the Rich Kids with a view of mixing this electronics, this new technology, with traditional rock instruments. The Rich Kids were a powerful band, and I just wanted to expand that sound a bit. And I actually used the synthesizer on the Rich Kids album in a track called Marching Men, and it immediately broke the band in half. Half the band hated this thing, didn't want anything to do with this technology, and half the band loved it. So in the dying embers of the Rich Kids, Rusty Egan, who was the drummer in the band, and we loved this whole idea of exploring and experimenting and whatever. And we put together Visage. We put together a studio combination of musicians that we loved and admired. So guys from the band Magazine, and of course Billy Curry, keyboard player with Ultravox, who were still very much in existence at the time. So this was a
Right.
studio project that grew out of the Rich Kids. It wasn't a matter of saying, "Well, I'm going to change my hairstyle and jump across into this
Sure, yeah.
With my synthesizer, I kind of helped create it. It was as I say, a segue.
Right, that's nice. So a nice smooth transition into that, and maybe it was because you all kind of liked that style a bit more that you had quite a big success early on because Fade to Grey was a hit early on for you on the first album as well. So again, you had this kind of early success with this group. Were you quite proud of that to have that early success again with this group?
Oh, absolutely. And that was a very different thing having the success with something that you were in control of. I'd produced the record, we'd created this thing that a lot of people were talking about, electronic dance music, but not electronic dance music based from American music, but very much rooted in European music. So the Blitz kids and all of that stuff, a lot of media exposure, all excited about what we were doing at the time. Of course, I didn't realise that by putting the whole Visage thing together and getting this bit of success, that I was going to end up slipping into Ultravox, who I thought were brilliant. I thought they were an amazing band. So again, some things in hindsight look as though you've made a plan of where you're going to go next, what's your next move, where are you going to jump to now? And it doesn't work that way. Sometimes these things just unfold in front of you. I didn't know Ultravox were going to go off on tour while we're making the Visage album and come back a broken band, with no singer, no guitarist, and to be dropped by the record label. A sort of band, the kind of job prospects you would run a mile from, unless you
Right.
loved the music. And of course, I jumped at the chance of joining this brilliant band.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. Before you went to Ultravox, though, you also had a stint, like kind of as an interim member, if you like, in Thin Lizzy as well.
Well, I'd actually joined Ultravox at that point. I was putting the finishing touches to Fade to Grey, to the first Visage album. Ultravox had come back from America. I'd joined the band. We'd started writing the Vienna album, but we had no money. We had no prospects. As I said, the band were in debt. We had no management. We had nothing lined up, no label. So I got the phone call from Philip Lynott, from Thin Lizzy, saying, "Can you come out to America tomorrow? Gary Moore's not in the band anymore. We're opening up for Journey. We're playing these mega domes, these massive places." I'd never been to America, so I went off there as a hired gun for 3 weeks to absolutely love the whole prospect of limos and jets and
Wow.
American rock life in the late 70s, while Billy Currie, the keyboard player, went off on tour with Gary Newman, who had just had
Wow.
Our Friends Electric and Cars and things. So we both went off and did that. In order to generate the income we needed to put into Ultravox to buy the equipment we needed to make the Vienna album.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. So you were really kind of in three bands at the same time, technically.
Yeah, I hadn't
It's
thought of that
incredible.
yet. That's
It's
that's
incredible.
ridiculous, isn't it? Yeah, I was finishing Visage. I just joined Ultravox, and I was a temporary hired gun for Thin Lizzy.
Absolutely incredible. Did you find it a bit stressful at the time? Obviously, you had to do it because you needed that money for Ultravox, as you say, you needed to do it. But did you kind of struggle maybe with that job, the heavy workload?
Oh God, no, 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 no. You're young, free, and single, and you ate and breathed and slept music. So all of a sudden, you were in an environment where you were allowed to do all of these things. This is before any commercial success had happened. So the idea of being allowed to put this Visage project together and being an Ultravox and starting to create this music where I felt at home for the first time, and then go off and tour with Thin Lizzy. None of it was a pressure at all. It's like going to a sweet shop and someone saying, "Don't just take these ones, take all of these ones as well." You got all this big pile. No, you're not going to turn it down. It was great fun.
Of course, yeah, of course. I mean, then with Ultravox, yet again, it's the same kind of story with many of your other bands in terms of the early impact that you had, especially. I mean, it must have felt quite good for you to join that band and then again have fairly early success because Vienna, which you were writing, and the album and the track were both big hits yet again. Surely at that point you must have realised you were quite good at what you were doing.
No, I have to say, and I'm not being coy about it. I joined the right people. I found the three guys who were left in Ultravox when I joined the band were exceptional musicians and real talents, and they taught me a lot when I joined the band. So, when you've got a unit that does its thing, and then you take an element of that unit out and put a different element in, it kind of changes the entire dynamic. And it was just the right dynamic. We were not, looking to make commercially successful hit records. We wanted to make them accessible, but we wanted to make something that was interesting music. Hence, Vienna was the third track from that album to be taken as a single, because no one could see a 4.5 minute long piece of music ever getting played on the radio. But we didn't care. We were making what we felt was interesting music. So when it did become successful, of course it's like watching your kids win a race or something. It was like, yeah, that elation, it's mine. It's I've done this. This is a wonderful thing. So it was the world was an exciting, incredible place at that point.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. And just jumping back a bit with Thin Lizzy as well. Obviously, talking about big hit records. Phil Lynott done Yellow Pearl, and you worked on him with that as well. That was his big solo hit, and the theme for Top of the Pops for a couple of years as well. That around the same time as Vienna. So, I mean, what about that? Yellow Pearl was obviously slightly different to Vienna, but what about that having a smash hit like that with
Again,
Phil Lynott?
again, you can't design something like that. If he hadn't called me up to go out and do the tour that I did when I just joined Ultravox at first, I would never have been asked while he was looking for a permanent guitar replacement. I went back to Ultravox, and Ultravox already we'd released the Vienna album. Philip asked me then to go to Japan with Thin Lizzy, but on keyboards. So, because he wanted to incorporate a bit of synthesizer, because he was very aware of what was going on. He wanted to incorporate a bit of that into Thin Lizzy, and then I'd jump up at the end of the set and play 4 or 5 tracks on guitar to give it a kind of thing at the end. And
Yeah.
we used to jam at sound checks, and I was on keyboards doing this da 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 thing, and he would thump away on his bass. And when we got back from that tour, he called up and said, "I'm doing a solo album. Can you come down to the studio and we'll try and knock that idea into shape and see what we can do?" So I brought down Rusty Egan, drummer from the Rich Kids, and Visage, and Billy Curry from Ultravox, and we created this Yellow Pearl track. Nobody saw it becoming, the theme tune for Top of the Pops for a few years. But yeah, it was, again, some of these things just happen. They unfold. No matter, you could sit and wish until you're blue in the face that things like that might happen to you, but you have to be in the right place at the right time with a lot of luck, and we had a lot of luck.
Right. I mean, of course, there is luck involved, but I think credit where credit's due. There were some brilliant songs written,
Well,
not
thank you.
just with Thin Lizzy and Phil Lynott, but certainly with Ultravox as well, and so many hits. Obviously, we'll talk about your upcoming catalog hits tour in a short while, but with Ultravox especially, you had a strand of hit singles, Dancing with Tears in My Eyes and Him, and I mean, the list goes on. But today, saying it politely, about 40 years later, is there a memory or a song or something that from around that time with those hits that stands out above the rest? Maybe one that you perform still today that you think, yeah, that one's probably my favorite of the bunch.
Do you know what it's like? And I've said it before, that songs are kind of like your children. You love them all because they're yours, but sometimes they annoy you, and sometimes even the biggest successful, commercially successful ones, sometimes you get a bit fed up with,
Right.
because you're performing them a lot, or you're hearing them more than you hear the others, and it's always the ones that got away that you think that was one of the best things I've ever done. And it's not necessarily the most successfully commercial things, the most accessible ones. But the reality is that the ones that do become commercially successful are the ones that carry, the ones that people don't hear so often because they make the album successful, and that's where the good stuff lies. So I think I've got to look back at stuff and think, okay, Love's Great Adventure. It was a one-off single. We did it because the record label were putting together a compilation album of all the hits, and they wanted a new track on there, and we kind of knocked that up in a day or two, and it's a pop record, and there's nothing arty or overly clever about it. But my God, it really does its job as a record, as an earworm, as something that gets in your head and you can't stop singing it. So yeah, I think that's the one I'll say is a bit of a favourite right now.
That was great. That's brilliant. I mean, you wouldn't get many artists saying that one of the best records they put out, they knocked up in a day or two, to quote. I mean, that's impressive. That is very impressive.
Well, everything else that you do is all part of an album, and that seems like that's a body of work that takes months, whatever, to write and arrange, then record, and mix and produce and all of that stuff. But to do a one-off single, is quite an oddity, I think, in my life.
Yeah, yeah. Was it a common thing for Ultravox to, I'll use the phrase again, knock up something in a day or two, or was it, like you say there, most of the time you did spend a lot of time perfecting it, getting everything right, and writing these records? Was it a long process most of the time?
Well, it was a long process. I mean, initially, there's a thing that happens with artists, and it's called a second album syndrome, where a band, an artist, has his entire life to write the first record, then they make it, and it becomes hugely successful if you're lucky, incredibly lucky. Then you got on tour to promote that record, and while you're on tour, your record label saying, "Well, we need the second album now," and you've got a month or 2 months or 3 months to write and record the second album. And then the second album's not quite as successful because you haven't had the time to craft it and spend all that energy putting it in, putting into it. So the Vienna album, yes, we'd written and recorded all the stuff and toured most of it, so that by the time we came to record it, we did it all in 3 weeks, entire album, start to finish, done. But the follow-up album, because of the success that Vienna had, we went into the studio and spent 3 months. We hadn't written any songs. We created all the songs in the studio as an experiment. So there is no tried and tested way of how these things work. Sometimes you can knock up an idea in a day or 2 days, and do it from start to finish. Most of the time, it's a lot of slog. You got to get in there and you analyze it too much when you know it's an album.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I suppose that's the case a lot. You think about it too much, and
Yeah,
maybe it was
absolutely.
all right the first time around. Now, obviously, something else that would have taken a lot of time for you to plan and prep would have been the Band Aid and the Live Aid projects. And I'm sure you've been asked every question about them under the sun over the past 40 years or so. But I'd feel silly not to ask about them at least. I know a bit about how Band Aid Live Aid, sorry, came around, but Band Aid itself, do they know it's Christmas? What was the initial thought process with that? The very first spark where you thought we could kind of make a change here?
It was Bob. I have to say, I was doing a TV show, a music show, the Tube, up in Newcastle, and I was chatting to Paula Yates, who was Bob's girlfriend at the time. I don't think they'd got married yet, and I'd known Bob and Paula for a while. Bob was on the phone to Paula just before I was about to go on and do this live television show. And she handed me the phone, and Bob said, "Look, I've just seen this horrendous footage, the Michael Burke footage on the BBC about the famine." And I didn't know what he was talking about because none of us knew about this famine. And he said, "Look, I want to do something. Will you help? The Boomtown Rats aren't in a position to pull anything off, but maybe you and I can do something." We met up, decided that in a very cold, calculated way, if we had a Christmas number one, if we could write a song, you couldn't just cover a standard Christmas song because 50% of the money generated from selling a record goes to the songwriters. So we had to write something. So we thought if we write a song and we can get a few of our mates to come along and bring their audience with them, and try and get a Christmas number one when the charts freeze. So over the Christmas and New Year period, the charts don't move, but you can sell twice as many records in the number one position then as you could any other time of the year. So it was kind of calculated. It was kind of cold and planned out. I went home from the meeting and came up with a little da 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 thing. Bob came to my studio with a guitar and played something that changed every time he played it, sang these lyrics, "Hey, Christmas time," and I said, well, go away and leave these bits with me. And I arranged the track and played all the instruments that you hear on the record. And he went off and, with his fishing rod and started fishing for rock stars and found all the best, the biggest and brightest stars that the UK had. And we had one day to do all the vocals, the choruses, Phil Collins drums, and mix the record, because it had to be in the pressing plants the next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning in order to be pressed up and put in sleeves and distributed and be out there in time to have a Christmas #1.
Wow. So a bit of pressure then, a bit of a deadline, just one day. And with all these stars in the studio as well. And obviously you got to produce some massive names there as well. That's just, I can't believe that one day to get that out. Did you feel, again, it's a similar question to a lot of the other records, but did you feel a lot of pressure, especially with a 1 day deadline and these big names who'd kind of come along and you were kind of relying on them to make this record successful? Was there an element of, oh God, we've got to get this done?
Of course, yeah. There was a time constraint. Obviously, that was massive. At this point, it had already become a 3-ring circuit to be. The media were all over it. What do you mean a bunch of pop stars who are selfish and drive around in Rolls Royces or whatever the image was at the time, are doing something for these people they've never met and don't know and probably will never meet? Why are they doing this? So there were cameras all over the place and stuff. So you felt huge pressure to get this thing done, especially as it wasn't the best song in the world. It was an okay song. It had been put together very quickly. All the artists who turned up had never heard it. Of course, you couldn't email them. The emails didn't exist. The internet didn't exist as we use it now. No mobile phones. So they all turned up cold. To come and do this, because obviously they'd all seen the footage, they all knew exactly why they were there, but they didn't know what it was they were doing. So the best thing they'd ever done in their lives, they gave it their all. We needed them to step up to the mark and do it. And it's scary, you're standing there with people that you've read about but never met, who sold more records than you have, who are global names, they're the world's figures, and you're telling them that they're singing flat, or say the melody doesn't go like that, it goes like this, and you're singing it to them. That's scary stuff. And trying to rush them through to get it all done in time. I had to kick them all out the studio by like 8-9 o'clock at night, because I had to start mixing the record, and you can't have people hanging about talking and chatting and having a good time while I'm trying there desperately to get this thing to sound like something. So it was a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it turned out all right. I mean, one of the best-selling singles of all time. That's not a bad thing to have under your belt.
It did well.
Yeah, got you a bit of money, but of course, most importantly, money for the charity and the awareness as well. But that was taken to a whole nother level completely with Live Aid. The concert itself, having a single is great. As I say, raising a lot of money for the charity and the awareness across the whole country and across the world as well. But to put on a whole concert with all of these huge names must have been even more of a great deal for you. But again, I think it's 40 years next year that Live Aid celebrating that birthday. All these years later, it's still recognised as groundbreaking and the greatest concert of all time. I mean, putting that together must have been so much more stressful, but at the end of it, so much more kind of relieving as well. You must have felt great after that.
No, you got to remember that it wasn't just us doing this. Bob had come up with the idea of doing the global concerts. Luckily, we had put together the Band Aid Trust, a body of people who helped us oversee the funds that the record had raised. And every day we were having meetings for hours on end, We've never owned a telephone, we never had an office, we never had a secretary, but we used everyone else's. So we would have these meetings all the time about what we were doing with the royalties that were already coming in for short-term aid and then into long-term aid. And one of the problems that we had was that all the aid agencies working in the field were all using a trucking cartel to get their goods, up country. And they were paying a lot of money for this. And we thought we could maybe break the cartel by buying our own fleet of trucks and drivers and stuff. And we didn't have the money to do that. It was an expensive thing. So in order to try and do that, the idea of Live Aid was born. So 3 months of talking about how impossible this was going to be to pull off, satellite technology for television was still in its infancy. It was at a time when nobody had mobile phones. You had to book a transatlantic call if you wanted to talk to somebody in America. It was, technology was still in its infancy compared to how it is now. So it was a real uphill struggle to get it done. But one of the guys that we had on the Band Aid Trust and still have is Harvey Goldsmith. Harvey he puts on massive concerts, and even he balked at the idea of doing this thing with a concert either side of the Atlantic linked together. The other guy we had on there was Michael Grade, Lord Grade, who was the head of the BBC, a very handy man to have if you want 5 hours of live television. So it was a combined effort. Bob and Harvey were the ones responsible for banging on people's doors and, accosting bands and telling them they better do it, or telling them they are doing it, or worse still, telling the world that they were doing it and they hadn't agreed yet. Yeah. So there's a lot of bludgeoning to get this happening, but everyone was pleased that it did happen, of course.
Of course, absolutely. And such a massive team of behind the scenes, and obviously the people performing and the people watching. I mean, incredible numbers. So many people involved. To go from that then to going solo, where it wasn't just you, of course, but, you started doing stuff on your own. It was your own name on the records and that. What made you decide to start putting records out under your own name, to go solo?
It wasn't a choice, really. It was an evolution, and maybe not an evolution in the right direction. Band Aid and Live Aid took me away from Ultravox for nearly 2 years. And by the time I got back to Ultravox, we were a very different band. We'd all pulled in different directions. Like any relationship, that's difficult. It's difficult to step in and think, I'll just pick up where we left off. Well, you can't. That was 2 years ago, and everyone's grown up and moved on and done different things. And when we finally made an album together, it was very disjointed. And I think had we been a bit more grown up, we could have seen that through and realised, oh yeah, we're just pulling together again, and the next album will be right and we'll be back on track. And instead we just kind of went, you know what, I've had enough, I'm going to go and do something else. And that was it. It was time to kind of move on from the confines of a band and I suppose the security of a band, and stick your neck out and try something else. And that's when the solo stuff started, really.
And did you feel a bit more kind of freedom with that, maybe being able to,
yes,
obviously you've done a lot of writing and producing with the bands, but doing stuff on your own?
It's a scary thing, some days you think this is brilliant because I don't have to listen to other people, tell me what to do. But the next day you'd be thinking, this is dreadful because I don't have other people telling me what to do. It's the same thing. The grass is always greener. When you're in a band, you're all trying to achieve a similar goal, not the same goal, but a similar goal, by pulling and manipulating something and turning it into something that you're all happy with. But when you're on your own, you're left to your own devices. You don't have a sidekick. You can't just go, right, I've taken this as far as I can take it right now. You come in and you add something to it. You pull it in your direction, then we'll pull it back again. And that's how it works with a band. So being solo at times was great, and at other times was very isolating.
Right. And again, you had many hits on your own as well. Clearly at that point, if you didn't realise that you had a bit of a talent for it, then there's no hope really. But your solo career, and then back with Ultravox for everything we've talked about today and more, I imagine, is going to be featured on your upcoming tour, which is November and December this year, as I've mentioned a few times. 26 dates across the UK, which you don't get these days. Usually a tour is London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham, and that's it. So 26 dates is extensive now. But what can we expect from you on this tour? Catalogue the hits, it's called. So obviously some hits in there.
Well, I tour constantly. You know, I was touring last year in the UK and finished off with a fantastic birthday bash at the Albert Hall in London.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to carry it on. I just thought this is a celebratory moment. It's not something new going out on tour for me, but I wanted to call it Catalogue and expand wider than I normally would on a tour. So maybe taking stuff from the Rich Kids through Visage, through Ultravox, maybe even a bit of Thin Lizzy in there.
Wow.
So it's a much wider spectrum. And I've got my band Electronica, who are, they're fantastic, multifaceted musicians. And we do a thing called a silent stage. So there's no amplifiers on stage at all. So what you hear out front is like listening to hi-fi. So if the power went on the sound system, you wouldn't hear anything coming off the stage. Even the drums are electronic. Everything's all DI.
Wow.
So we've put together this fantastic thing that enables me to cherry pick what people would expect to hear, what people might not expect us to play, along with some deeper tracks that maybe didn't see the light of day quite as much.
That's what we like at Radio Caroline. We like the album tracks, stuff you don't hear in many other places. So I like the sound of that. So Midge Ure's Catalogue Tour comes to a venue near you in November or December this year. Extra dates are already being added, which is fantastic. You know, a month or so ago, you already announced some more dates. So nobody's going to want to miss out on this. midgeure.co.uk is the place to go to avoid disappointment. But Midge, thank you very, very much for your time today. It's greatly appreciated. If you ever wanted to come out and explore a bit more about the history of Radio Caroline, then our ship, the Ross Revenge, is still out off the Essex coast. We do tours, so we'd be more than happy to have you come out when you're over here
I'd
and show
love
you
that.
around. That
I'd
would be.
love that. I'd have to bring my seasickness pills with me though.
It's not too rough. It's not too rough, but always best to be safe. Well, hopefully we'll see you soon, and I'll certainly see you soon, November or December. I'll make sure to be there. But thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.